And now just to get started, so I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's workshop. So I am happy to introduce Dr. Kristin Lynn Sainani as the speaker and host of today's workshop about online science writing. Dr. Sainani earned her PhD in epidemiology at Stanford University in 2002, and the same year earned a certificate in science writing from UC Santa Cruz. Currently, she is an associate professor of epidemiology and population health at Stanford University, where she teaches biostatistics and science communication classes. Additionally, Dr. Sainani conducts research related to sports injuries and osteoporosis. Beyond her work as an academic educator, Dr. Sainani has also worked as an editor for science journals, as well as a health columnist for Allure magazine. With her extensive experience in writing about science for a variety of audiences, I am so glad that we have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Sainani today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Sainani to talk to us all about online science writing.
Thanks, Amanda. And thanks for having me. This looks like a really great series. I'm so glad to see scientists getting training in these kinds of skills, because and you guys already did this survey, so I'm going to skip that. It's so important, and I think we're really seeing that with the whole COVID pandemic, that it's not just science, it's how you communicate science. And so this is a really, really critical skill, is how to communicate science effectively. And I've broken the workshop up into two parts today. I do write for a wide variety of audiences. So I am sometimes writing journal articles, and I'm sometimes writing for extremely general audiences. The one thing that's shared, and that I do the same, regardless of audience, is that there are certain principles of effective writing that we all need to follow. And unfortunately, if you look at the scientific literature, scientists in general don't do a good job. The scientific literature is not well written. And so I always like to start with just talking about what makes good writing for all audiences. And then in the second half of the workshop today, I'm going to talk specifically about what you do differently when you move from writing for a journal to writing for a general audience. What are the things that are different? I do really want this to be interactive. And so I'm going to encourage you to actually use the annotate feature in Zoom. I'll talk about that in a minute. Also put questions in the chat, jump in with questions. It'll be much more fun if this is interactive, and we don't need to wait till the end for questions. So I want to keep this sort of lively, and I won't always monitor the chat, but I'm sure one of our hosts will be monitoring the chat to let me, and will alert me if you got a question. So again, I'm going to start here with just principles of effective writing, and I'm going to start with some examples of the kind of writing that you see in the scientific literature, because unfortunately scientists have bad habits when it comes to writing. And the first thing before you can even start to think about writing for general audiences is just to recognize that we have some bad writing habits in science. I wanted to show you this annotate feature in Zoom if you've never used it before. If you hover over and get your options, you'll see there's an option for the annotate feature. And when you click that, a little menu bar comes up, and it's got fun things like you can draw, so you can underline things that you want to highlight, and there's little stamps, so you can put arrows, and there's even little text boxes if you want to try editing things you see on the screen. Feel free. So I want to encourage everybody, as I read through this, to figure out that annotate feature and underline things that strike you that maybe the language is not as crisp as it could be, or things that are confusing. Again, these little stamps are fun because you can put little stars, and so go ahead and play with that feature. We'll just keep it more interactive, but I'm going to have a lot of these little paragraphs up, and as we talk through them, it's a lot of fun to actually try your hand at editing them. Great, I see a lot of you are figuring it out. Excellent, good. All right, so let me just read through this one. This actually came from a sports medicine journal. It's actually one of the top sports medicine journals out there, and it reads, "Considerable attention has been paid to napping as an effective countermeasure for arousal decline and for improving cognitive performance. The previous literature has demonstrated that naps less than 30 minutes undermine the deleterious impacts of sleep deprivation that affects arousal and performances. It has also been reported that naps enhance arousal levels even when the quality and the quantity of the previous nocturnal sleep are adequate. It would be of interest to mention that the difference in results found in previous researches depend on the diversity of factors that determine the benefits acquired when taking short naps. Indeed, factors like the quality of the prior nocturnal sleep, sleep architecture, and the temporal placements of the nap during the day may determine the extent of benefits gained through short naps." Great. I see you guys are all marking it up. So you figured out the annotate feature. I'd love for some of you to type in the chat your reactions to writing like this. Anything come to mind in this writing? So go ahead and like type your thoughts into the chat or keep underlining here. I see that we've got a lot of people have underlined it would be of interest to mention. That's a good one to pick up. Has been paid to napping. That's passive voice. Excellent. I'm seeing a lot of verbose, indirect, passive voice. What a pause. What do they mean by arousal? There's a lot of unnecessary phrases that could be shortened. Visually difficult, big block of intimidating text, nominalizations, wordy. These are all great thoughts. Yes. Unnecessarily wordy, so much jargon. Yes. Yeah. You're picking up on all the things that I want you to pick up on here. Lots of stuff undefined. Excellent. Yes. So there's just, this is not easy to read, right? So I don't read this and go, yeah, I get it, right? And the reason I like this particular example is, again, it's from a published paper in a very good journal, and it's about napping. So it's not about quantum physics, right? There's no reason that we can't all understand napping. And I feel like the authors are almost working really hard to prove to us, you know, napping is really complicated and difficult, and we're studying something hard. You don't need to convince me that napping is an important scientific topic. Sleep is really important to human beings. You don't need to convince me of that by hiding it all in this very complicated language. So you guys have picked up on all the things that we want to get out of the habits of doing. Yeah, has been paid to, that's passive voice. And then a lot of wordiness. I like, somebody highlighted the temporal placements of the nap during the day. Thank you, that's my favorite part of this one. Temporal placements of the nap during the day. What are they trying to say? That's a very long-winded way of saying the timing of the nap, right? So I took a stab at, I'm gonna clear these now so my slide can advance. I took a stab here at just translating this to say, you know, what are they actually trying to say? And how can we say it in a shorter form? So here's my translation. Short naps improve alertness and cognitive performance in individuals who are sleep deprived, as well as those with adequate nightly sleep. However, the extent of the benefits may vary depending on factors such as the quality of the prior night's sleep and nap timing, right? You can boil it all down to that. And it's no less scientific. It's no less, you know, it's getting in all the ideas. You're not losing anything, but you're getting it across to your reader faster. All right, so let's do another one here. This is a little bit shorter, but another one of my favorite examples. This was in the first sentence of a paper in a really good oncology journal, again, a published paper. And I was actually writing about this science for a general interest magazine. So it's some really important, interesting science. But here's the first sentence of the introduction section. Adoptive cell transfer immunotherapy is based on the ex vivo selection of tumor reactive lymphocytes and their activation and numerical expression before reinfusion to the autologous tumor-bearing host. Go ahead and mark that one up again. Don't be shy with the pens here. Great. Great. I love that you guys picked up on autologous tumor-bearing host. Who's the autologous tumor-bearing host? What's a short way to say autologous tumor-bearing host? Let's see. You guys said in the chat there. Yes, that's the patient. Exactly. That's one of the reasons I love this particular example. The autologous tumor-bearing host, that's a really dehumanizing way of saying the patient. Good. Adoptive cell immunotherapy. That's a really long term. That's the, we get selection, tumor reactive lymphocytes. I love how everybody underlines selection, expression, reinfusion. Great. Those are all nominalizations, right? Nouns that could be verbs. You could have said select, expressed, reinfuse. Excellent. Yeah, so same thing. This is just one sentence, but it's really hard to parse. It's really hard to understand what it means. I have a background in biology and I know what each of those individual words means. When you put them together like that, I don't know what you're talking about. So the minute I read something like this, I know I'm going to have to struggle to get through the article. You don't want your reader to have to struggle. So I'm going to clear those just so I can show you I actually, because I was writing about this for a general audience and I had to understand it, I actually found another definition online. And this was in Nature Reviews Cancer, where they did a better job of defining it. And they said adoptive cell therapy uses a cancer patient's own T lymphocytes with anti-tumor activity expanded in vitro and reinfused into the patient. And when I read that, I was like, oh, now I get it. So this is much easier to understand because we don't have autologous tumor-bearing host, we have patient. And also notice that instead of saying expansion and reinfusion, they say expanded and reinfused. They use those verb forms. That helps the reader to understand what's going on. If you turn verbs into nouns, it's really hard to parse. If you use the verb form, then we can say, okay, this is what's happening. We can actually see the action. All right, one more fun one. This comes from a paper actually that I was reviewing a few years back, and this was their aims statement at the end of the paper. So it says, as such, the purpose of this study, and again, feel free to get your annotate out and annotate as I'm reading this. As such, the purpose of this study was to present the development of a theoretical model of factors and potential relationships and processes explaining variation in workability based on a thorough assessment of the biopsychosocial variables in patients with cervical reticulopathy. So again, long-winded. Good. I like how you somebody underlined as such. Yeah, we don't need the as such, right? We just say the purpose of the study. Forget that's just clearing your throat at the beginning of the sentence. Present the development of a theoretical model of factors and potential relationships and processes. I'm glad somebody underlined that one. That's one of my favorite parts of this particular sentence. So what is a theoretical model of factors and potential relationships and processes explaining variation? So I also teach statistics. That has a very short name. Anybody want to put in the chat? What is a model that explains variation? Anybody know? A simple way to say that. Yeah, it could be a predictive model. It could be, I like Chris, a model, yes. It's an ANOVA or a linear regression, exactly. It's just an ANOVA or linear regression. It's just a simple regression model, which we all, it's very familiar in statistics. It's not it's something everybody uses. That is a very long-winded way of saying a regression model. Yeah, assessment of biopsychosocial variables, thorough assessment. Okay, do you need the word thorough there, right? Let's assume that if you've done your science well, that it would be thorough. We don't need to say that to the reader. Good. So yeah, you guys are all picking up on all the things that are problematic with this particular sentence. Because, yeah, and the actual disease isn't said until the very end. Good, yeah, Isabel. Yeah, and now this is the aim statement of the paper, so we've already had some introduction, so it actually might be okay in context. But if this was the first sentence of the paper, yeah, you don't want to wait till the end to say who we're talking about. This was actually the last sentence of the introduction, setting up the aims of the study. Because it's an aim statement, you actually don't even need to mention the statistics that you use. So when I made a suggestion for editing this, I said, well, you just say what you're trying to do, and we don't need to know what statistic you're using unless the statistic is something novel. And Juliana says lots of prepositions make it clunky. Yes, it's super clunky to read. And I think one really good tip is to read your writing out loud, because when I read these out loud, it's especially apparent that they're clunky. Yeah, all those extra prepositions, and it's just a really long sentence. That's one sentence. It's a huge block of text. So what can we do with this one? So I suggested to them to rewrite it. And again, you don't really need to put the stats method unless it's something novel. So I think the aim of the paper was just the aim of the study was to identify risk factors for impaired workability in patients with cervical reticulopathy. That's it. That's all that study was trying to do. They were trying to say, what were the risk factors for these patients having impaired workability? That's it. It gets lost, right, in all of that extra prose. And yet, this is how much of the scientific literature reads. Let me clear the annotations here. So what are the hallmarks of these examples that I just showed you? So they're hard to understand, right? They're not easy. You have to sit there and struggle, and it's like reading a foreign language. You have to translate. They're boring. And one of the biggest things that I think we do wrong in science is we don't often think about the reader on the other end. So I'm trained as a scientist. I'm also trained as a journalist. The first thing you learn when you study journalism is you have to think about your reader. So that's all about the reader, right? I've got to hook the reader in. I've got to make sure the reader understands. I'm thinking about all the ways to engage my reader. As scientists, I think we're almost never told that. And so the reader is just, oh, reader on the other end. We don't think about that reader. That means that a lot of science is really boring to read. And so I don't know about you, but you probably have a stack of papers that you need to read for, maybe you're doing, you're writing a paper, you need to read the literature for your introduction section. I do a lot of paper reviews. And so I've got a stack of papers I'm supposed to review. I never look forward to reading them because I know they're going to be boring, right? So imagine if the scientific literature wasn't boring, if we actually thought about the reader on the other end. These examples are also needlessly complex and wordy, as you guys pointed out. They have a lot of gratuitous jargon. So yeah, it's okay if you're writing for a scientific audience to have jargon, absolutely fine. But don't put in jargon that's not necessary, like the autologous tumor-bearing host. Just say patient. They use big words to describe small ideas. So the theoretical models of factors and relationships and processes explaining variation, that's a really long way to say a regression model. Just say regression model. They use a lot of prose that doesn't really say anything. It's really empty. So a lot of kind of vague, not helpful prose. Right, so Chris says autologous tumor-bearing host could also cover mouse models. That's true, like if you weren't talking necessarily about patients, so maybe you have a reason. This was a study, though, that was in humans, so. All right, so these are the kinds of things that we don't want to do. And so how do you avoid this kind of academic scientific jargon when we're all used to it? We all see this in the scientific literature. So we need to learn to relearn principles of effective writing that unfortunately I think are not often taught in grad school. So very simple things, not hard to learn, but just take some amount of practice and somebody pointing them out to you. So one thing I want to talk about today is cutting clutter. We all have a tendency to put a lot of extra words in. All those do is slow down the reader. So we got to go learn to cut those out. You have to be even better about that if you're going to write for a general audience, because the general audience is not going to stick with you if you have a ton of clutter. And you also want to learn to write with verbs. Again, verbs make the sentence go. They are the action of the sentence. And if you write with nouns instead of verbs, it's very hard to follow the action. Again, very important for scientific audiences, even more important when we turn over to talking about general audiences. So this is another one where you can get your annotate pen out, and we're going to go through this particular sentence word by word and see all the clutter that we can cut. So let me read through it and get your pen out and go ahead and you can mark it up. Just make edits on there. So it says this paper provides a review of the basic tenets of cancer epidemiology study design, using as examples studies that illustrate the methodologic challenges or that demonstrate successful solutions to the difficulties inherent in epidemiologic research. And you can hear how wordy that is, right? When I read it out loud, this is not a complicated thing. They're saying, hey, we're going to tell you about cancer epidemiology study design. A lot of extra words in there. Great. I love that you guys are marking this up. So we'll go right word by word here. So first of all, this paper provides a review. I see that you guys already figured out that we could just say this reviews. I think I left it as this paper reviews, but you could say we review or this reviews. Yeah, not even need the word paper. But provides a review of, we don't need that, just say reviews. Then we get of the basic tenets of cancer epidemiology study design. I'm going to go through my edits. Anybody? Thank you, Sonia. Yes. Let's get rid of basic tenets of. Okay, so think about it for a minute. I think on a first draft, we often say, I want to say that I'm talking about the fundamentals of something. But basic tenets of, very, very vague. So when you say that, it doesn't help me as the reader. If you just say provides a review of cancer epidemiology study design, notice you don't miss basic tenets of because it's so amorphous, it's so unhelpful, it's too vague. And then I love that we've got a lot of people marking up using as examples studies that illustrate. You can hear that's awkward, right? We don't need examples and studies. So using examples that illustrate, or you could say using studies that illustrate. You actually don't need both of those. So good. What did I do here? I kept examples rather than studies, but you could keep studies rather than examples. You only need one of those. Great. Then we get that illustrate the methodologic challenges. Thank you for deleting methodologic. Excellent. Yes. So methodologic, another one of those kind of vague, empty words, doesn't help the reader, especially you might think, well, but I need to tell the reader that I'm talking about methodology. Well, you already told the reader you're talking about study design. So guess what? The reader can infer that when we're talking about study design, we're talking about methodology. So great. Get rid of that one. Great. And then I see you guys that illustrate challenges and solutions, and wonderful. You all deleted demonstrate and successful. Okay, so great. So why do we delete demonstrate there? Well, illustrate and demonstrate mean the same thing, right? That's a repetition. And I can imagine that the author was sitting there and saying to themselves, oh, I've already used illustrate, don't want to repeat myself. So what do? They go to the thesaurus, they find demonstrate. When you catch yourself doing that, it often just means you don't need the second instance of the word at all. And we've got another comment in the chat. Study design might need to account for social challenges, no, or is that considered methodology? So I think study design kind of covers social challenges as well. Remember, this sentence is just saying, hey, we're going to be talking about study design, so I don't think we need to get totally into the specifics here. And yes, and Vanessa says it's redundant. Yeah, illustrate and challenge and demonstrate is redundant. I like how everybody deleted successful solutions, because there's no such thing as an unsuccessful solution, right? If it's a solution, it is by nature successful. And so it's actually redundant to say successful solutions, because you can't have an unsuccessful solution. Great. And then I see a lot of you just cut the end. So the difficulties inherent in epidemiologic research, and I indeed just cut that completely, because difficulties repeats challenges. Epidemiologic research, where we know we're already talking about cancer epidemiology study design, so we don't need to repeat that. So you can see there's just so much you can strip out of this. This paper reviews cancer epidemiology study design using examples that illustrate specific challenges and solutions. And I like even going down to we review or this reviews and getting rid of paper even. We could even trim this a little bit more. Great. So you can see just how much is in there that you can cut once you start thinking about it. So anyway, right, the original language doesn't talk about social challenges. If they called it out specifically, keeping social challenges in might not be redundant, but that's not what it says. Yeah, it's hard to know without having the authors in the room exactly what they were trying to say. And so when we do some of these examples, you'll notice you're using a little bit of judgment about what the author actually wanted to say. Most of the time, luckily, when I edit things, I actually have the author in the room, or I can talk to the author and say, what were you actually trying to say here? We're making a little bit of guessing on some of these, but all right, great. So let me clear that. And then I'm going to talk now about the kinds of clutter that you want to watch out for. So we identified a bunch of clutter in there. So just a few tips on what is the clutter that you want to kind of keep your eyes out for. All right, so something to watch out for. We saw a few of these kinds of things in the one on napping. Sorry, my screen is frozen here. It'll come up. There we go. So deadweight words and phrases, these things that you start the sentence with, like in the napping one, it might be of interest to mention. It is worth pointing out. It is important to note, as it is well known. We tend to stick these at the beginning of a sentence, and I think it's partly just sometimes you have trouble getting started on a sentence. So it's fine if those slip in a first draft, but they're deadweight because they're totally not necessary. You can just go and cut them. And I'll give you some more examples of each one of these in a minute. Empty words and phrases, things like basic tenets of, right? Methodologic, a profile of. It doesn't add anything because it's so amorphous that it's not giving the reader a concrete picture of anything. I can't picture a basic tenet or a profile in my head, right? And so one of my all-time favorite quotes in writing is by William Zinsser. This is a great little classic writing book if you want to pick one up, William Zinsser on Writing Well. And he says, some words and phrases are blobs. And I just love that description, because a blob is a perfect description of basic tenets of, right? It's very blobby. It doesn't add anything to your writing. And a few years ago, I discovered that there's a little creature called a blobfish. We actually have a little stuffed blobfish in my house. And so this is a good picture to have in your head when you're tempted to write things like basic tenets of. So my kids are learning to write. And so when they write very vague, amorphous, blobby prose, like the book was interesting, I get out the little blobfish, and we call those a blobfish in my home. So you can put that image in your head when you're writing. Don't write blobfish. Watch out for long words or phrases that could be short. So we have this terrible habit of using the most words we can to describe something rather than the fewest, except when people write abstracts. Then they're good about trying to tighten things up because there's a word limit. But this is like writing that theoretical model of relationships and processes explaining variation. Just say regression model. I have this theory that we all had a class, back in like 10th grade English, where the teacher said, oh, you've got to write a 10-page term paper, and none of us had 10 pages worth of ideas. So what did we do? We all learned to pad our writing with a lot of extra words. So now you got to get yourself out of that habit. You want to convey the idea as quickly as possible, not in as many words as possible. Unnecessary jargon. So again, for scientific writing, when you have a scientific audience, it's okay to use some jargon, but don't use it gratuitously. And I'll talk a little bit about acronyms and abbreviations in a minute here, because that's a pet peeve of mine in academic writing, and you never want to use those if you're writing for general audiences. Watch out for repetition, illustrate and demonstrate. I think as scientists, we sometimes feel like we need to say the same thing 3 different ways because we're teaching the audience, but you gotta trust that your reader only needs it once. And then watch out for adverbs. They don't add much to your writing, and so usually you just want to strike those out. You'll notice I love adverbs in speaking, but in writing, I'm pretty good about cutting them out. So I'm going to go over each of these with some examples. So deadweight phrases. So this, again, sort of throat clearing at the beginning of a sentence, and has also been reported that it should be emphasized that it is worth noting that. Notice that in all of these, really what you're doing is sort of starting the sentence, and a lot of it is just telling your reader, I think this is important. Like, here's an important fact. The fact that you are writing about it tells the reader that it's important. You don't have to highlight and say, hey, this is important, reader. The reader gets that just by virtue of the fact that you're writing about it. So here's an example. Again, I pulled this out of the published literature. It says, it is important to note that less than half of the food companies had documented any emergency plans associated with pandemics. So there is a deadweight phrase here. It is important to note. Again, you don't have to tell the reader this is important. You wrote about it, so that means that you think it's important. So notice that you don't lose anything if you just drop it. Fewer than half of the food companies had documented any pandemic emergency plans. Totally not needed. All right, empty words and phrases, your blobfishes. So here's a sentence again from a published paper. It says, mental health depends not only on individual characteristics, but also on health determinants, which require an analysis of the influence of the environment on the individual's ability to stay healthy. So that one is a bit of a brain teaser. What are they trying to say there? The reason this is so hard to understand is because it has a lot of blobfish in it. So individual characteristics. That's very blobby. It's non-specific. Health determinants. Again, that covers so many things. I can't picture a health determinant in my head because it's not concrete. An analysis, well, that's really broad. The influence of the environment, also really broad. An individual's ability. These are all so broad and vague that they're not helpful. And so you can trim this one up to something like a person's environment influences their mental health. That's really all they're trying to say there. Get rid of all the blobfish. We have this tendency, again, to put extra words when we don't need them. Instead of saying most, we say a majority of. I just was editing for a student the other day. They had a set of 160 patients. I just edited that to 160 patients. Are of the same opinion. That's just agree. With the possible exception of, that's just accept. Completely unanimous. That's a lot like successful solutions, right? You can't be unanimous if it's not complete. So that's redundant. So here's one example. The evidence base underpinning the effect is weak. That has a few things we can trim. So evidence base, we can just say evidence. You don't need to say evidence base. Underpinning, that's a really long way of saying for. So how about just saying the evidence for the effect is weak? Unnecessary jargon, and I'll talk a little bit about abbreviations in just a second here. We saw that one earlier. Short naps are an effective countermeasure for arousal decline, right? That's a really complicated way of saying short naps may improve alertness. Don't make it more complicated than it is. Just say what you mean here. We don't need to get into complicated language like countermeasure for arousal decline. One of my biggest pet peeves when reading the scientific literature is the use of acronyms and abbreviations. We have this bad habit in science of just making up abbreviations as we go along. And these are terribly hard on the reader. And so again, when we talk about writing for general audiences, you never want to do this. And I'll get students saying, well, but I defined it at the beginning, so it's fine, right? Remember that, first of all, not everybody reads in a linear fashion. So they may not read the beginning. Sometimes we're skimming things. Secondly, if you've got a bunch of abbreviations, even if you define them earlier in the article, by the time the reader gets to those abbreviations in the actual text, they're going to have forgotten. It's hard to hold on to a whole bunch of abbreviations in your head. That's really hard on the reader. So here's one I was reading recently, again, published paper. In addition, a better understanding of the cap of swimming pool patrons, especially parents of young children, would enable the development of evidence-based education programs to reduce the likelihood of AFR and reduce the likelihood of an infected person swimming. So just out of curiosity, anybody have a guess or know what those abbreviations stand for? There may be some disciplines where these are used widely, but they're very narrow. Anybody? So the problem with abbreviations, again, is I have to stop as a reader, and I see CAP. I don't know what that is because it's not familiar to me. I got to stop. I have to think about what it might be. I have to go look back in the paper to see if I can find it. It's very cumbersome on a reader. It's like having a foreign word embedded, in every sentence. So CAP is actually knowledge, attitudes, and practices, and AFR is accidental fecal release. But you wouldn't know that unless maybe you were in a very narrow area like you did infections. If you do have to, Claudia asks, if you do have to introduce jargon or abbreviations, is it better to do it at the beginning or the end? Okay, so if for some reason you feel like you really need to put an abbreviation in, my recommendation is, first of all, question that that assumption that you actually need it. Maybe you think you need it, but you don't. But if for some reason you do have to use some jargon or abbreviations, what I would do is actually introduce them at the beginning of every new section of your paper. Remember, if we're talking about a scientific paper, people don't read linearly. So you can't assume that when they get to your methods, they've already read the introduction, or when they get to your discussion, they've already read the introduction. So I would reintroduce them at the beginning of every new section of your paper. But again, question whether they're really necessary. So I was just reviewing something where they abbreviated inpatient and outpatient as IP and OP. Now, as I'm reading along, every time I see IP and OP, I have to stop and think about it. If you just wrote inpatient and outpatient, which is nice short words, not too big, I'm not going to be upset as a reader. I actually prefer to see those words. And I think part of this is we were taught in English not to repeat ourselves. And I think one of the reasons we have this impulse to abbreviate everything is that in a scientific paper, you have to repeat yourself. You have to say the same term over and over again. You don't want to change it because that would confuse your reader. So you start to repeat yourself a lot, and then you go, oh, I'm repeating myself. I don't want to repeat myself. So what do? You turn it into an abbreviation. It's absolutely okay in a scientific paper to use the same term over and over, and your reader would actually rather that you write it out. So really good rule of thumb on abbreviations is if it's not an abbreviation you would use in speaking, then don't use it in your paper. So like in speaking, I'm not going to say IP instead of inpatient. I'm not going to say CAP instead of knowledge, attitudes, and practices. I would, however, say DNA in speaking, right? In speaking, I'm not going to say deoxyribonucleic acid. I'm going to talk about DNA. So that one is so familiar that we already use that. The abbreviation is used more than the long word. So in that case, it's okay to use it. Otherwise, I would recommend not using anything that you don't use in general speaking. Yeah, and so Chris says familiarity is field specific. Absolutely. So that's what I was saying. Like if you were in the specific field of people who looked at infected pools, you might know CAP and you especially might know AFR, right? Maybe that's commonly used in a few specific journals in neuro fields. What I want to argue to you though is that you want to write for the broadest audience possible. So I am a statistical reviewer for a number of journals, and I am often reading about things where I am not in the niche field. I am the statistician looking at it. So I'm not going to know any of this terminology, and I'm going to be annoyed as a reader. So that's not good for you getting past my statistical review. And if you're only writing for the scientists who are in the same little narrow area as you, unfortunately, I think that keeps science from moving faster. So I always encourage scientists to write for the broadest audience possible, not just for the niche journal that you're writing for. All right, so other things to watch out for again on your clutter. Takes a minute sometimes for my slide to advance. A second here. So the next thing was repetition. So again, as scientists, we sometimes feel like we need to say things in 3 different ways. You gotta fight that urge a little bit. So like this one, this is why physical exercise is avoided as far as possible when heat load is heavy. Is scheduled early in the morning or in the evenings when climatic conditions are more favorable. So notice it's saying the same thing. We're going to exercise, we're going to avoid exercise when it's hot, and we're going to exercise more when it's cool. Well, you don't need both of those, right? So you could just say, this is why physical exercise is scheduled when temperature is cooler in the early mornings or evenings. And then adverbs. Again, I love them in speaking, but you got to give them up in writing. They don't add anything. They don't make your writing stronger. So interestingly, really, quite generally. So for example, this one says, the present study demonstrates very clearly that EHS occurs mainly within the first hours of exercise. You absolutely don't need that very clearly. So if you take it out, you don't lose anything. Actually, the writing becomes more powerful. The present study demonstrates that And there was an abbreviation there, EHS. You may not have known what that is, so I just wrote that out. Isn't that nicer to have it written out? That exertional heat stroke occurs mainly within the first hours of exercise. All right, so that's clutter. The second principle of effective writing that's really important to master for all audiences is learning to write with verbs. So I'm going to talk about 3 principles of writing with verbs: using active voice rather than passive voice, using strong verbs, and not turning verbs into nouns. All things you should pay attention to in your writing. So just a quick reminder, active voice versus passive voice. If it's been a while since you've had grammar, how do you recognize that? So active voice, she throws the ball. We've got an agent, the person or thing doing the action. We've got the verb, and then we've got the thing acted upon, the object of the verb. The passive voice inverts that. The ball is thrown by her. Weird, right? We don't speak that way. We're not going to say that. And so how do you recognize that? How do you recognize when you've gone into passive voice? Well, that is a little clue there. There's always a to be verb. So is thrown by her has a to be verb there. So that can help clue you in that I might have gone into passive voice because I've got that to be verb is what are, was, were, be, be, now. And that main verb is always going to be in the past tense. And it has to be a verb that takes an object or you can't turn it into passive voice. So if you say she runs, like the activity of running, you can't turn that into the passive voice. But if you say she runs the company, then you can say the company is run by her. And I've got a question from Jennifer in the chat. How do you feel about surprisingly when the data goes against a previously reported model? You know, sometimes it's nice to use something like paradoxical or surprising, even though that's an adverb, since that's a kind of an underused adverb. I'm okay with surprisingly. I might say something like, yeah, I could see surprisingly being a useful tool, or paradoxically I like. So sometimes when you want to signal to the reader, hey, I want you to pay attention to this, and you want to signpost it a little bit, that something is surprising, I would allow that adverb in there. It's because sometimes that's helpful to the reader to just know that, hey, this is something unexpected. Yeah. All right, so let's do an example of passive voice. And again, it's awkward because we don't talk this way, and so it's funny that we fall into this in writing. So here's the to be verbs, a little clue that you might have fallen into passive voice. So here's an example from Strunk and White. My first visit to Boston will always be remembered by me, right? We don't talk this way. How do I recognize that this is passive voice? Well, I've got the object of the verb, what's being remembered. Then I've got my passive verb. The will be is your to be verb. It's the clue that you've slipped into passive voice. And then the agent, the thing, the person doing the rememberings at the end. So to turn that into active voice, you just say, I will always remember my first visit to Boston. That's much more natural. It's kind of easy to see these in examples like this, but when you get into science, sometimes it's a little hidden. So here's a scientific example. It says the activation of calcium channels is induced by the depletion of endoplasmic reticulum calcium stores. That one's a little hidden, but that's actually passive voice. And again, the is induced by can help, the is there can help clue you in. Because if you think about who does what to whom, it's the depletion of the stores that activates the calcium channels. So we've got the order backwards here. So to turn that one into active voice, you would say depleting calcium from the endoplasmic reticulum activates calcium channels. You can see that that's much crisper. It's also shorter, right? Because when you turn things into the active voice, you realize I have 2 verbs that mean the same thing, induced and activate, right? I didn't see that before, but when I turned it around, I don't need to say depleting calcium induces the activation of. No, I would just say activate. So you can actually trim it up. It gets a little tighter, and it's clearer, like who is doing what to whom. So use the active voice. Of course, passive voice exists in the English language for a reason. I'm not saying you can never use it, but if you're going to use it, make sure you have a good reason for using it. All right, we also want to use strong verbs. In science, we have, really bad habits when it comes to verbs. And Claudia has put in the chat, HemingwayApp.com to find passive voice in long pieces of text. Oh, okay, great. So there's a little app, HemingwayApp.com. I actually don't know that one. Thanks, Claudia. And you can put your writing in there, and it'll flag your passive voice for you. Microsoft Word has a built-in grammar checker that actually does an okay job at flagging passive voice as well. Isabel writes, I struggle with using I or we in scientific writing. Yes, that is a great question. I think we all feel a little, when you first, especially when you're a young scientist, you feel a little awkward writing I or we because it sounds so personal. And you just have to get over that. You may have had somebody along the way tell you it's not okay to use personal pronouns. That is absolutely wrong. Every scientific editor I've ever spoken with says, no, we want you to use personal pronouns. We want you to use active voice. So it's absolutely okay to use I and we in scientific writing. It's expected, totally fine. I think you just feel a little self-conscious the first time you do it because you're like, oh, I'm bringing myself into the paper. But remember, scientists are humans. Humans did the science. It's absolutely okay to say I or we. I write a statistics column for a journal, and I've been doing this for over a decade. I think the first 1 or 2 columns that I did, because it's only me, I'm the only author writing the column. And so I had to use I and actually not we. And it felt a little like, huh, that's weird. But I got used to it, and it's perfectly fine to use I. And then Bonnie asked, what's a good reason to use passive voice? Great question. So yeah, there are instances. So why does the passive voice exist? The passive voice exists if you want to highlight what was done rather than who did it. And where is a part of the manuscript where you might want to do that? In the method section. So in the method section, sometimes I sometimes will still, I still prefer to put my method sections often in active voice. But if I'm editing a student's work and they have it in passive voice, I'll usually just leave it that way. Because you might want to emphasize the what was done. The cells were mixed, and more than we mixed the cells, because it's the cells that are important and not the who did it. And so I think method section, if you want to put that in passive voice, it's fine. And then there may just be some instances as you go along in your text where, again, you want to emphasize what was done over who did it. So it's okay to turn it into passive voice. If you know you're turning it into passive voice and you're aware of it and you can tell me why you did it, I'm usually okay with it. It's only when it's just there for no reason that I'm going to edit it out. All right, so then using strong verbs is another important point. For my slides to advance here. So we have this, a lot of the verbs we use in science are really boring. And some of it we can't get around. But verbs make sentences go. It really is the driver in the English language. So here is a sentence that I mucked with. This came from a novel, and I've made a little change for illustration here. It says, loud music came from speakers embedded in the walls, and the entire arena moved as the hungry crowd got to its feet. Perfectly fine sentence. It's actually pretty evocative. It's not bad. But compare that to the original. The original was, loud music exploded from speakers embedded in the walls, and the entire arena shook as the hungry crowd leaped to its feet. That second sentence really jumps off the page at you because of those great strong verbs. And so we may not always get to use verbs like exploded, shook, and leaped in science, agreed. But as we talk about writing for general audiences, you get to bring in some of those more exciting verbs. And in science, we certainly can do better than always using provides, demonstrates, show, is. There are better verbs than that. Another one of my favorites, so we just had Perseverance land on Mars. This came from Curiosity. It's a really good sentence. NASA's intrepid Mars rover Curiosity has been through a lot in the past year. It flew 354 million miles, blasted through the Mars atmosphere, deployed a supersonic parachute, unfurled a giant sky crane, and touched down gently on the surface of Mars. And I love that sentence because of the great verbs. It's kind of poetic, right? Blasted, deployed, unfurled, and touched down gently. So those great verbs really make that very poetic. So we don't want to turn verbs into nouns, and we've seen some examples of that already today. We saw provides a review of earlier, and we could have just said reviews. That was an example of turning a verb, to review, into a noun, a review. We do this all the time. Obtain estimates of. We could just say estimate. Has seen an expansion of. Expand. Provides a methodologic emphasis. Emphasizes. Take an assessment of. Just assess. So we have this terrible habit of doing this in science. Just use the verb form. These are cases where we took kind of a nice verb, a spunky verb, estimate, expand, emphasize, assess. For science, those are pretty good verbs. We turned it into a boring noun, and then we paired it with a really weak verb, obtain, seen, provides, take. We don't want to use a lot of obtain, seen, provides, and takes. Those are boring. And we saw this in the immunotherapy example: selection, activation, expression, reinfusion, all verbs that had been turned into nouns. Select, activate, express, reinfuse. Turn those back to the verb forms. And that's what they did in that better definition. They said expanded and reinfused rather than expansion and reinfusion. Much easier for you to understand. All right, so we're going to do a little practice exercise, and we can just do this in the chat. So I will read some out of the chat. So what I want you to do is read, these are just 2 sentences I pulled out of a published paper. There's lots of different ways you could edit these, but I want you to edit it into something shorter, cut out the clutter, make it a little bit tighter. So it says staff awareness and hygiene are 2, and if anybody wants to just do this on the screen, you're welcome to do this on the screen or in the chat. Staff awareness and hygiene are 2 of the most important attributes derived from the COVID-19 pandemic affecting food safety. On the other side, temperature checking of workers has been rated as an attribute of limited salience and importance. So you probably can get this down in 1 sentence and cut out some of that clutter and make it a little livelier. Yeah, thank you on the other side, Michael. Yes, we don't need on the other side. Good, excellent. Yeah, so I'll give you guys a minute or 2 minutes here. Come up with a rewrite, put it in the chat, or again, if you just want to write it right on the screen, go for it. All right, I'm going to start reading a few of these out. So Delia writes, staff awareness and hygiene improve food safety during COVID-19, but temperature checking of workers does not. I love it. Good. Food safety during the COVID. This is Greer. Food safety during the COVID-19 pandemic is most affected by staff awareness and hygiene. Temperature checks of workers have limited benefits. Excellent. Adam, during the COVID-19. Sorry, I lost Adam. There's Adams. During the COVID-19 pandemic, staff awareness and hygiene improved food safety. However, checking workers' temperatures demonstrates limited importance. Good. Chris, the COVID-19 pandemic revealed that staff awareness and hygiene are critical for food safety, while worker temperature checks don't help and aren't readily understood. Moen, staff compliance and hygiene are more important than temperature monitoring. Employee temperature shows limited importance. Good. These are all really excellent rewrites, and I'm sorry if I didn't read them all here. Luella, while many food staff have improved hygiene during the COVID-19 pandemic, taking worker temperatures has proved less important to safety. Nice. Kay, staff education and hygiene improved food safety during the COVID-19 pandemic, while monitoring employee temperature shows limited importance. Excellent. These are all great. Yeah, well done. I came up with 2. My edits are, I think your edits are better than mine, but we found that staff awareness and hygiene impacted food safety during the COVID-19 pandemic more than checking workers' temperatures, or we found that staff awareness and hygiene improved food safety during the COVID-19 pandemic, whereas checking workers' temperature had minimal impact, depending on whether you wanted to say temperature had any impact versus no impact at all. All right, so take-home messages on the scientific literature part. I think a lot of the scientific literature is actually gobbledygook. It's really poorly written, and it's a problem, and you guys can all do better writing as scientists for scientific audiences. And then we're going to switch in a minute to talking about writing for general audiences. I'm going to pause there, though, for a minute and see if there's any questions on this first part before we talk about what you do differently when you write for general audiences. Everything I just talked about applies to writing for general audiences, but a few things are different. Catherine says, when there's more than one way to rewrite a sentence, how do you decide which version is the most effective one, or prioritize which one to pair with the rest of the paragraph or context? Catherine, there's an unlimited way to rewrite sentences. So actually, when I'm editing for other people, I do tend to try to preserve a little bit of their voice. And so I might not just start over on the sentence. I might start with what they have and try to bring out what it is that they're trying to say. And so when I'm editing, I tend to defer a little bit to the author to try to keep some of their voice in the way that they conceptualized it. When I'm writing my own, sometimes I'll rewrite that sentence 3 different ways, and I'll figure out which one just sounds the best to me. But yeah, there is so many ways to write the same thing that you're going to come up with, 2 people are going to come up with 2 totally different ways, and it's a matter of a little bit of preference in style, and everybody has a little bit of a different style. So for some of these editing exercises, you don't have the author sitting there and you don't have the context. So it feels a little bit harder to do these. When I'm editing things, I usually have the author available to me so that I can say, well, what were you trying to say there? And that helps a little bit with rewriting these properly when we know what the author was trying to get at. Let's see. So Catherine writes, sorry, is that one? Chris writes, trimming jargon often also means a loss of precision or needing to trust people to connect concepts introduced with one form of jargon to the same concept with a different form of jargon? Is that something you consider? So again, if you're writing for a scientific audience, if the jargon is important, there's no, in a scientific paper, there's no problem with putting in jargon if it's useful. I would argue, maybe you could convince me that autologous tumor-bearing host has a meaning that was useful to use that jargon, except that I did see that same thing defined in 2 different places, and the one where they said patient was easier for me to understand. So I think it's okay in a scientific paper to leave that jargon in. We're going to just talk in a minute here about jargon in writing for general audiences. Obviously, when you move to writing for a general audience, you're not going to use any of that jargon anymore. Writing for general audiences often does involve a loss of precision and not accuracy. And that's one of the key points in writing for general audiences is we're going to reduce precision, but without sacrificing accuracy. But in a scientific paper, how do you decide whether to keep the jargon in or not? Well, if the jargon has an important meaning, I'm going to let you keep it in. If you're just using the jargon to show your advisor that you learned a really big word, I'm going to strike it out. And so if you have, again, it's like passive voice. If you can tell me why you think that you have to use the jargon term instead of the simpler term in your scientific paper, I'm going to allow you to leave it in. You're writing for general audiences, different story. Then we're going to talk about how to get rid of it because the jargon doesn't mean anything for a lay audience. Now, there are cases when writing for general audiences where that jargon is actually the important point. And your job then as the science writer is to explain the jargon, but you're never just going to throw it in without unpacking it. Great question. Other questions about what we've just talked about? All right, again, if questions come up as we go along, please feel free to just dump them in. Okay, I see another question just came up. Oh, Patrina's question, thank you. Yeah, sometimes it's hard to see all of these. Oh, how do you think about the culture that promotes this sort of dense jargon-laden writing? Younger scholars learn from examples in the literature or discourse in disciplines. Great question, Patrina. Yes, thank you. Chris, for pointing out that I missed that. That's a great question. Yeah, why do we promote this kind of terrible writing? I mean, I do think it says something not so great about the culture of science. So why do we use dense, jargon-filled writing in science? I think there's several different reasons. Of course, one of my missions in life is to get people to stop doing that. And so I'm definitely think all of these are bad reasons, but why has this crept into our culture? Well, I think there's several possible reasons. So one of them, unfortunately, as you all are probably aware of, is we don't have great incentives. The incentive structure in science needs improvement. Unfortunately, as a lot of you are being in academia are aware, when it comes to things like promotion, the way people are judged is by things like how many, first author papers did you publish? I think that's the worst metric ever, because why do I care that you managed to publish 20 papers if they are all terrible and unreadable, right? But unfortunately, these metrics are built in, and changing those, although there's some movements to change those, changing those takes time. So that's one thing. I think if you only care about being published and you don't care if anybody reads it, that's an incentive to write very badly. Another problem, I think, is, we're egos in science. Don't want to get myself in trouble, but sometimes I think we use jargon to prove that we're smarter than other people. Of course, it has the opposite effect because it doesn't make you sound smarter to use a lot of jargon, but I think sometimes it's trying to say like we're elite and nobody else can understand it, and we have this little clues, and that's some of the culture, unfortunately, in academia too, is that there's something wrong with trying to communicate to a general audience, because then you're not in this little closed group. So I totally disagree with that, but that might be part of the culture. And then of course, it's also just what young scientists see, as you said, Patrina. If you're reading the literature and this is what you see, then guess what? You assume that that's the way you've got to write in order to get published. And so it's a self-perpetuating cycle, because you see bad writing, you copy bad writing, right? And it never changes. And there's actually evidence to show that the writing is getting worse in science. And so how do we change that? Well, see, that's why I love talking with young scientists, because if I tell you that actually you got to rethink that, and you guys can change the world, and you guys are going to fix all of our problems like climate change, and you're gonna all be better writers. This is the only way it's going to change is with young scientists actually rethinking the way we write in science. And so all of that has to do with changing the culture of academia and science. That's not an easy thing. But I'm trying to do my part by at least getting the message out that it's okay to write in a clearer style and actually preferable. Good.